College football nerds here to talk about something that kind of interrupted everybody's Friday, and that is the news now reported by everyone. It was kind of just a rumor, but now reported by everybody that Texas and Oklahoma are shopping their way out of the Big Ten Conference, and the likely landing spot is going to be the SEC. We're here to do a quick breakdown. We're going to do a bigger video later, but we need to get this out because topical, algorithm, you know how it goes. Josh, I think that, part of me feels like this is just a big conspiracy to get the joke back that the SEC teams don't travel and don't play big games out of conference since Alabama's got Oklahoma and Texas lined up on the schedule already. And the world just wants them to not have good out-of-conference games. But in reality, CBS, Dennis Dodd reporting, and I think many others at this point, that Texas and Oklahoma are looking for a new spot to play football or maybe all sports, and that likely place is the SEC. We're going to get into the rumor of maybe them going somewhere else in a second. But first, I want you to kind of break this down for us at a high level of how this might be good and how this might be bad for college football.
The good part really just comes down to the fact that you end up with more competitive conferences. The reality is that college football is headed in the direction where super conferences were an inevitability. And if you're the SEC, you're trying to position yourself such that you are in the best position you can be when that happens, right? I mean, the last person to get on that boat is going to be the worst. And that's going to be true in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different contexts, which we'll touch on pretty briefly. But I think maybe the benefit is in this like expanded playoff world. We've had a lot of dilution with G5s and expansion. And if you just make the biggest conferences that much bigger and stronger and then cut off the rest, it could be better from a competitiveness aspect. The bad is we've had a lot of dilution and not everyone is going to get Oklahoma and Texas. This is going to trigger a set of dominoes in the sport where the other conferences are going to pick up teams and then those conferences are going to get worse as a result. And, we've talked about this a lot, right? Like the Big Ten did not benefit from getting Rutgers and, like picking up Nebraska and all these recent moves they've made. I mean, like how many times have we had that discussion, right? Like Rutgers and Maryland have just been diluting schedules in the Big Ten for years.
Yeah, and I think that what scares me about this is, if you're in the SEC, that's great. You've got this, we're hurtling towards this super conference concept, but if the SEC is the team that keeps taking the really good teams, or even if it's the Big Ten, that scares me for the rest of college football. That scares me because I care about Texas Tech and Baylor, and I care about them having a seat at the P5 table. But what did we see? This is my question to you, Josh. What did we see with this last round of realignment where Colorado and Utah, and no disrespect to them, but that's who went to the Pac-12. That was already on the weakening side of conferences, but they still have a seat at the table in the same footing as the SEC or the Big Ten. Now we're going to do another round of realignment where the best teams available on the market are going to the SEC. And now we've got the Pac-12 maybe fighting for scraps to pick up a Baylor or a TCU. No offense to those teams, but like if you keep adding, I don't want to say scraps is a disrespectful thing, but just in terms of, how you can contextualize this, if we keep adding those to an ACC or a Pac-12, do you think they need to continue to have the same equal footing in terms of playoff and perception, or is this de facto relegation?
I think the conversation gets really difficult. And I won't call Baylor and, like Texas Tech necessarily scraps, right? I mean, those are solid enough programs, but they're still mid-tier programs. Let's be fully real. Oklahoma has been the dominant team in the Big 12 for years. And Oklahoma and Texas historically are absolutely the two dominant programs in that conference. And now they're just mixed in with another one. So the SEC adds two top-tier programs, whereas you're adding teams that occasionally will vie for a title. But like Texas Tech, in case maybe once in a blue moon, they're even in the conversation. But I think the important thing to realize is those are the best-case scenarios, okay? So Let's say that the five major conferences still exist, and they have 16 teams each. That's 80 total teams. There are not 80 good teams here. I mean, the Big 12, if they lose Texas and Oklahoma, will only be at 8 teams. So for them to continue to exist, they would have to add 8 more. And if they add 8 more, then who does the Pac-12 pick up? And I've been looking at lists that people are considering for the conferences. And yeah, like the obvious ones, BYU, Cincinnati, UCF. In these 5 conference scenario, they're going to get picked up. The less obvious ones, and the ones that I don't think people are discussing, are like Tulsa and Eastern Carolina and Central Florida and, Temple, Tulane. Those schools will have to be absorbed because you just run out of really good options. In fact, you run out of good options, to be blunt. Tulane, no offense to you, but Tulane is not a P5 school and hasn't been for a long time. They're not close to it. But a P5 would have to pick them up to get to 16 teams. You just don't have 80 in that list. There's only about 5 or 6 that you really would want. And yeah, I think a lot of this conversation comes down to whether there are 4 conferences or 5. If there's 4 conferences, then we're talking about who fights over Baylor and Texas Tech. And then a bunch of those Big 12 schools, maybe Kansas State, are just going to get left out in the cold and become flat out a G5. They're not going to have a landing place at all because there's not enough slots. If you have a 5th conference where there's 16 more teams, now, yeah, those get picked up, but you've got to find like 10 more, and they don't exist. So you end up in a really bad no man's land where people are going to get dropped or teams are going to get pulled up to where conferences get really diluted, in which case the conference that picks them up, let's say it's the Big 12 trying to reinvent themselves, is going to, I'm looking at a suggestion right now that's Memphis, Navy, South Florida, SMU, Temple, Tulane, Tulsa, East Carolina, Central Florida, to go along with Baylor, Kansas State, Texas Tech, TCU. That's a G5. I mean, you've basically created a weaker version of the Big East.
And Big East used to be considered a P5. And so we can't have a situation, and this is why I don't like this. I'll be just completely blunt. I don't like this because I don't think if this happens, I don't think it's right that the conference the hypothetical you just named is having, in terms of auto bid playoff spots and considered a P5. It's not the same. And we saw what happened when the AAC grabbed all the teams that were left from the Big East when, Miami and all this realignment happened. That was not the teams that they grabbed that were left over was not a major power P5 conference, even though they had a bunch of teams in it. And Josh Pate talked about the other day, and I don't know if he's aired this yet, but he and I were texting about it, and he was concerned that the SEC is going to become college football. And it's going to do what McMahon did for wrestling, where everything is just the SEC because there's such a power dynamic there, that the gravitational pull is there, and it's so much different than the rest of college football. And I don't want that to happen. We used to be SEC fans as a channel. I hate the idea of that happening. I love the balance, and this to me brings less of the West Coast in, which you and I have fought forever to get. We're dying for the Pac-12 to be good again and irrelevant again. That's healthy for the sport. This is not healthy for the sport, but what could be healthy, and I want you to weigh in on this, is there's a rumor that the ACC was also talking to Texas and Oklahoma, and that is also an option on the table. Now we go from what you and I think is a pretty bad situation of these two teams going to the SEC and just completely throwing off the dynamic. But in my mind, an actual really good thing for college football would be if Texas and Oklahoma went to the ACC. Tell me what you think about that.
Yeah, if Texas and Oklahoma were to go to the ACC, they get, you end up in a situation where they get, let's say you build the ACC into having enough top-tier teams to where they can be competitive. They've got a problem right now where Miami and Florida State have not panned out, and I think they are rebuilding, but it's still not enough to form a full conference. The bottom half of that conference is not particularly good. Oklahoma and Texas changes that dynamic immediately. It becomes competitive. And because they haven't gone to the SEC, and let's say we all go to 16 teams, right? Now, the SEC is going to have to pull a couple more. That maybe pulls from the Big 12. Maybe you've got enough left to go to the Pac-12. I think the Big 12 basically ceases to exist. Teams are going to go east, they're going to go west. Some are going to go to the Big 10, and it just gets kind of picked apart. And now you do end up with 4 conferences. The ACC finally becomes a deep enough conference to be continually relevant. Yeah, they've won a lot of titles, but their depth has been horrid. And it just has been on a consistent basis. I think it's more than likely in that situation, maybe that like West Virginia goes back to the ACC, Notre Dame goes back to the Big Ten. You get a little more geographical consistency. And I think that could end up being solid. Like, I think that's a solid result. The thing that I fear is ending up with basically an AFC and an NFC that's the Big Ten and the SEC. The SEC will be forever the dominant name in the sport to the point where it's almost the league in and of itself. The Big Ten will be relevant, but will be second fiddle forever if Oklahoma and Texas are in the SEC, I think, unless they pull Notre Dame and somebody else that's huge. Kansas ain't going to move that needle. And the Pac-12, the Big 12, the ACC at this point are far behind, and they have no option to ever catch up. And at least one of those is going to be relegated, maybe two, to being a G5. I don't actually think it's a bad thing to shrink the sport from like 130 to 80. The last 50 teams are irrelevant, and we put this out on Twitter recently. Miami of Ohio won the MAC in 2019. They went 8-6. They lost 76-5 to Ohio State. When your conference champion is giving up a 70-plus point loss to another conference champion, you aren't really in the same division. But it's just the way that it's not the fact that we've dropped it from 130 to 80. It's that we've dropped it to 130 and 80, but what is it? It's going to be like 7 of the top 10 in the SEC. So it's going to be the SEC, the Big Ten, and maybe somebody else, and then a lot of weak stuff thereafter, where even those 80 teams are now super striated conference to conference. I'd like to see maybe a move to 80 working okay, but make it balanced.
Yeah, and here's my main concern with all of this. So this new SEC Super Conference paired with the NIL, we got a video on NIL coming out, y'all. You're gonna like it. Paired with how they're doing NIL, paired with instant transfers, paired with this notion of expanded playoffs. All of this, everybody gives us a hard time about being shills for the best teams in the sport. It's actually the opposite. We see, because we follow those teams and we know the structure of the sport, we see all of these things combining together to hurt any opportunity the little guy has to really get on parity of any kind with the rest of the sport. And this, I think, is just another cut in that death by 1,000 cuts to getting there to where it's just going to be a handful of upper crust teams, and that's it. Any final thoughts before we wrap up this surprisingly quick video?
Quick for us. My final thought would be all our talk about why X team can't compete with Alabama or Ohio State. It's not that we don't want you to compete. It's more us trying to sound alarm bells for the past 5 years or so that, look, as good as you're doing, you need to understand how big this divide has gotten, and we're not going to climb it. And we say year after year, like, no one's going to beat Ohio State this year and keep them out of the playoff. No one's going to beat Alabama and keep them out of the playoff. And the exception in 2019, we both said like week 1, week 2, we knew Alabama was out due to injuries. It's really way too obvious, way too fast which teams are going to win. And we try to be realistic with it because you need to acknowledge the problem to fix it. And what we're saying right now is Oklahoma and Texas going to the SEC is going to be great for the SEC, but it makes the SEC essentially its own freaking sport. And the playoff outside the SEC, maybe occasionally somebody will beat them, but the team that comes out of that gauntlet most years is going to be better than anybody else in college football.
Well, and if we go to expansion, isn't it like the 6 teams that come out of the SEC? Like, isn't that
the playoff? Probably justifiably will have 4 to 6 SEC teams in a 12-team playoff,
Yeah.
and they're gonna win, and that's the bad thing. Partly due to just, you could say they beat each other up, but I do believe beating each other up means some teams get injured and they lose games they shouldn't, and they get knocked out of the playoff contention. But the team that stays healthy enough to win the conference or finish in the top 4 in the SEC, those teams, which it's going to be ultra competitive to get there, they're going to be so razor sharpened that they're just going to dominate playoff scenarios. And I honestly think in 5 years, it's going to make things pretty uninteresting.
I agree. All right, let us know in the comments what you think about what we said. Are we way off base? Are you excited about an SEC Super Conference? Or do you like the idea of Texas and Oklahoma going to the ACC? We're going to do a more broad, bigger, in-depth video on this when it actually happens. But until then, this is what you got. You asked for it. You got it. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great weekend, and God bless.